So the Vikings are trying to make a lot of money by trading from north to south, and they do that with their technology, which is the boat, but they have to find a way. Right? So they try to get down with the Volga, which doesn't work. They try to get down with the Dnipro, which does work, right? The river which runs through the middle of Ukraine. They eventually find their way down and they eventually start to trade. But this means that our Vikings, these Vikings, who are known as the Rus, these Vikings come into contact with Byzantium. They come into contact with Byzantium, right? Byzantium is the big economic and political power down there in the south. And they're aiming for Byzantium. They're trying to get down to Byzantium. And a midpoint, a beautiful trading post along the way is Kiev, right? So our Viking Age is not just like, Eric the Red in Iceland and the sagas, all of which is cool. And by the way, some of our Ukrainian figures actually appear in Icelandic sagas, which is gives you a sense of how it's all connected. But the Viking Age is about the Franks, and it's also about Byzantium, because the Vikings are trying to make their way down to Byzantium, and that's why they get to Kiev, which has already existed for several centuries. Okay, so Eastern Europe. What is Eastern Europe? One is always struggling for a reason to explain why Eastern Europe and not Western Europe. What's special about our little zone, which includes Kiev and what's going to be Ukraine in this context, is that it is between these two different kinds of Christianity. Not just in some kind of metaphorical way, like lands in between, blah, blah. It's between them in the sense that the Franks and the Byzantines are striving to control these territories. But it's also in between in the sense that it's Eastern Europe, or at least our part of Eastern Europe, where the Vikings, who have been in contact with both the Franks and want contact with the Byzantines, make their way. Okay, so those are a lot of the important pieces. The Franks, the Byzantines, Vikings. How do the Vikings make their money? They're slavers. I mean, it's not very romantic. That's what they do. They sell other things as well, but they're slavers. And so when they go from the north to the south, they are enslaving people as they go down, and they're trading them. I've probably told you this already, but the Vikings, although they were marvelous seamen, could not actually deal with the rapids. I told you this, right? They couldn't actually deal with the rapids of the Dnipro. And so so how did they pass them? They made the slaves carry the boats. And at their places where they failed to ride the rapids, they left runic markers of the Vikings who died, some of which we still have, right? The first people who could actually deal, to my knowledge, with the rapids are the Cossacks, who we're going to get to. Don't worry, we'll get to them 6 or 7 centuries down the line. Okay, so we have many of the pieces here. We have the Franks, we have the Byzantines, and we have the Vikings, who have to do with both the Franks and the Byzantines. What we also need are the other Slavic states. So, as I said before, every state is going to tell a story about how it emerged from nothing, right? It emerged from nothing. Our people came from a mysterious place over the sea. There was a city on a hill, whatever. Like, our people came from nothing. That's how it always starts. There's a blank slate. There were our people. It's wonderful. In fact, there's always a tremendous amount of copying, which is very awkward for the national legends, but very important for history. So, the state that emerges in Kiev could not have come into existence, again, we're talking about possibility, not necessity, could not have come into existence without Moravia and without Bulgaria. Okay, what's Moravia? Moravia is so hugely important because Moravia was the first Slavic state. It's the first one we know about, early 9th century. The first mention of it is in 822, quite a long time ago. Moravia is where the Czech Republic is now, roughly, and it was heavily under the influence of the Franks. To make a long story short, and I've mentioned this before, Moravia sets up the classic geopolitical situation, which is, okay, you're a little Slavic state, you have to be Christian. Why do you have to be Christian? Because you need to be recognized, right? If Islam had come further north, and remember, like from the point of view of 822, this almost happened. Right? If Islam had come further north, then you could be recognized by Muslim states, and that would also have worked. But that just barely didn't happen. And because it just barely didn't happen, the states you want to be recognized are the ones that are around you, namely the Christian states, namely the Franks. Okay, so they're under the Moravians are heavily under the influence of the Franks. Their ruler, who's a man called Rostislav, Rostislav does the natural thing, which is he sends an embassy to Byzantium. By the way, it's only very recently that embassies are buildings. It used to be that embassies were people who were sent with missions, with diplomatic missions. So they sent an embassy to Byzantium. Why? To balance. And this is the story everywhere. Maybe you have to be Christian, but you want to get the best deal possible, right? If you didn't want to get the best deal possible, you'd be a terrible ruler of your people. You'd be a terrible power calculator. And it's this conjuncture, this rivalry between the Franks and the Byzantines in Moravia, which generates the mission of those two gentlemen who we mentioned before, namely, what was their names again? Cyril and Methodius, right. Cyril and Methodius. So Cyril and Methodius are Slavs, probably, and they are Slavs who create a written language for other Slavs. That is another huge breakthrough and also an act of human creativity. Right? It's an act of human creativity which the importance of which lasts right down to the present day. If they had made it up differently, if they had, any little thing they had done differently would have meant an entirely different cultural history for all of our region. Right? At this point, these two men are the ones who lay it down. Now, they're laying it down for a purpose. They're translating parts of the Bible. They're missionaries. There's a distinct reason why they're doing what they're doing, but they're the ones who lay down a Slavic written language, which we now call Church Slavonic or Old Church Slavonic. They're the ones who make, in principle, the Bible accessible for a much larger group of people. Okay, so this mission to Moravia fails, as missions will, but it has two long-term consequences, which I want you to note. The first consequence of its failure is Poland. So this is not a course in Polish history, but as it will become clear over time, you can't really do Ukraine without Poland. And a very important thing to know about Poland is that it is a Western Christian country. So why is Poland a Western Christian country? It's a Western Christian country because of the Czechs. Because the Czechs got there first. The Czechs were a Western Christian country. In Poland, just like in other East European countries, there is Old Church Slavonic. There is a Polish declension of Old Church Slavonic. It was not fated that Poland was going to be a Western Christian country, but it became one when a Polish ruler married a Czech who was already a Christian. And that leads to conversion. So that's a consequence of the failure in Moravia. So the Czechs, but also the Poles, are Western Christians, and they still are, right? That's the way it's going to be. The other consequence of this failure is that the followers of Cyril and Methodius have to run, as one does. They and their students end up in Bulgaria, and it's in Bulgaria where the Glagolitic script, which Cyril and Methodius invented, was shifted over to a Cyrillic script, which is much easier to read and which is basically the alphabet that a bunch of people in this room were educated to learn when they were in kindergarten, with some minor changes. So by the time Cyrillic script was created, which is around the year 893, we now have an availability of an alphabet and a language for other states. The most important one of these states is Bulgaria. Again, Bulgaria, not our subject. I couldn't personally do a whole semester on Bulgaria, but one could do a whole semester on Bulgaria. It's a fascinating place. Who are the Bulgars? I know that when you woke up this morning, you were thinking, I hope Professor Snyder gets to this question of who were the Bulgars. I know this has been troubling you. And it is authentically confusing. The Bulgars are a Turkic people, some of whom stayed in what's now kind of south-central Russia and converted to Islam. So they're a Turkic people who stay in Russia, become Muslim. And just if we were doing the history of Russia, we'll do a little history of Russia, this is very important. A lot of the territory of Russia is inhabited by people who are Muslim. When I was in Ukraine last week, I was talking to a woman in Chernihiv Oblast who had 5 Russian soldiers in her basement. And of course, none of them were from European Russia, and 2 of them, I think, were Muslims. That's Russia, right? Russia has been a Muslim country from the get-go, among other things. But some of the Bulgars migrate and come to dominate part of the Balkans. And They seem to convert to Christianity around the year 865. And that's the prehistory of the Bulgarian nation that we know and love today. And the Bulgarians found a state which is Orthodox, Eastern Christian that is, but which is in rivalry with Byzantium. And that's a very important model, right? That you can be Orthodox and Christian, but not be actually part of the Byzantine Empire. That's a model of statehood. Very important, right? The Bulgarians get there first. And part of the way they get there is that they use the legacy of Cyril and Methodius, they use Old Church Slavonic, they develop a slightly national version of Eastern Christianity. But they're also creating a model of statehood.